So when we say supply chains are in transformation, what does it really mean? And we say in the supply chain industry that actually things are changing very, very fast, and that what made you competitive 10 years ago is not what's really making you competitive nowadays. And it's basically changing because of three things, which are in the title. So that's technology and changes in markets, as well as sustainability and changes in the global trading environment. And so we say we're creating the supply chain of the future, and it's really to basically acknowledge that the whole consumer interface and the retail is now very digital. Okay, so we've gone from an analog world to a digital world with e-commerce, with social media, with consumers being able to get anything they want in 24 to 48 hours, which means that if we think about the supply chain, the whole purpose of the supply chain is to serve the front end, to serve the retailer, serve the consumer, serve the buyer, and see what they want. Okay, and so if the consumer and the buyer are having much more information and basically making decisions differently using the power of information, and if they want things so much faster, then that means the whole supply chain has to adapt. So speed has been, and so we're moving towards an era where the whole supply chain is going to be digitalized, which is very challenging if you think about basically what drives consumption is a lot of developed countries, and who produces it is actually developing countries. And so obviously these two markets are developing at different paces, at different capabilities, different governance, different infrastructure. And so we're saying that the front end is digitalizing, but the back end is having trouble catching up. So basically, technology is reshaping markets and retail and supply chains towards a radical rethinking of how goods are made, sold, used, and today reused. And so in order to, because the front end, the retail, is digitalizing so fast and becoming basically an omni-channel world where you can buy anywhere. You can buy in the store, you can buy online, you can buy on your mobile, and so on. Then basically the way the supply chain has to adapt is to use different types of technology to basically manage the whole process that used to be managed with clipboards, manually by people using Excel spreadsheets, and so on. So some of the technologies that we're seeing a lot are obviously automation. So in a factory where things can be automated, they are like cutting, like some molding, like some injection, and so on. We're seeing a lot more use of cobots, collaborative robots, and actual robots to do things like sanding or moving, conveyancing, checking. There's RFID sensors. We're even looking at using DNA to monitor different things inside the factory, and then a whole range of different kinds of software. Probably the most significant among those is virtual design. So basically taking, if you think about the fashion designer in the past, they would actually be more like an artist. They would basically create several designs a day and manually make those and sew them. Have them sewn, making the patterns, have them sewn, ship it to the retailer, who would then basically make comments on it, and then it's reproduced, iterated several times, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth between production country and the developed market. Today, we're putting all of that online, which basically creates a lot of digital assets, not only the garment itself, but actually zooming in, looking at the fabric, creating different looks. So in the past, where you would have to actually take a physical garment and hang it on a mannequin to basically see how it hangs and how it responds to wind and movement. Today you can actually do that online, and that's all made possible because of the exponential increase in computing power and the fact that today you can actually get a lot of computing power for very cheap, and also storage of digital assets is now really cheap as well. So all of the things which just a decade or 2 decades ago took actually a lot of computing power, which was very costly, and a lot of storage, which was also very costly. Today, that's all very cheap because of the cloud. So we're doing things like putting as much possible online, doing as many functions online. Today, in the because of the restrictions around COVID and not being able to go to factories, some inspection of the garment, like for quality, is being done online. We're looking at different camera and remote inspection technologies. And basically, when you think about digitizing different processes and putting sensors at different places in either the warehouse or in the factory, what you're trying to do is actually create a lot of data from the process, not only to track the process, but actually to get more precise about what's going on in the factory, to troubleshoot in real time, and to basically get predictive in how you're managing your process, everything from line balancing to smarter production to down to the level of seeing which workers are working faster, the whole piece rate system. So it's basically trying to digitize everything that we can in the production process to get more data in order to run the production process more efficiently and also be more sustainable and targeted. And so a lot of that is obviously driven by sustainability, in that consumers, because they have access to, well, basically on the internet, you can find out anything you want about anything in the world, down to things in different countries and in languages that you don't understand. Through natural language processing, you can actually get through all of these barriers which used to block people from knowing what's going on in the world. So today, basically, because consumers know everything, then that means brands actually have to do a lot better. They have to demonstrate their values in products and services and their actions, especially today, that social media is so influential. So industries, which grew up on a compliance system, and that you have a supply chain, you tell your supplier your code of conduct, and the supplier checks the box and says, yes, I'm not breaking any laws, and I'm paying my workers on time, and so on. So now that's not enough. Consumers expect that suppliers are compliant, but they want to see, what are you doing for human rights? What are you doing to promote equality? What are you doing to promote diversity and inclusion? What are you doing to empower workers? And also all of the environmental issues now, climate change and water, especially plastic and waste, things which retailers basically could hide within their supply chain, like the plastic bags that we use to ship the goods from factories to the stores. We have to find solutions to everything, because now consumers want to know. It's not just consumers, and it's not just sort of government, because some governments in the world are not all regulating as strongly as they might, but also investors. So there's more assets under management, which is targeting, like positive, socially impactful investment, and the whole rise of ESG. The fact that now brands, they have to disclose a lot of indicators through their, if they're listed on different stock exchanges. Basically, every brand needs a sustainability story. Okay, and you need actions to back it up. And there's a kind of subtle brand building going on in sustainability world, where if your brand is known for sustainability, basically everyone's expectation rises, and so you always have to kind of push more and do more to prove that your DNA of being a sustainable company is actually genuine. Because today consumers and also investors and so on, everyone can tell. You can tell BS from greenwashing very easily. And so the worst thing is to generate cynicism. So we all have to do a lot to basically be better. So now shifting, we're in a time of great change in supply chains, also in the shift in global consumption. So if we're to go back, say 30 years ago, like 80% of global consumption would take place in the OECD countries, just basically Europe and US, driven by Europe and US. And today, we're in transition. China's growing very fast, especially in e-commerce, and basically by mid-century, the bulk of global consumption is going to be in the emerging markets, if trends are going as they are now, simply because of numbers of people. There's going to be like 2 to 3 billion middle-class consumers added in China, India, and the rest of Asia. So they're going to be buying a lot. So basically, supply chains, which once source in Asia and the rest of the emerging markets and sell to the West, they're now having to basically source everywhere and sell everywhere. And so the flow of goods is going to be changing a lot too. And also consumers, they're not a homogeneous group. Consumers in China are very, very different from consumers in the West. So a company like a big brand in the US, they can't just take the US model and then plop it down in China. They've got to basically rethink a lot. And that's also changing how supply chains operate. So obviously now we have this other element which came about in the past couple of years, which is basically geopolitical tension and rising protectionism. And so and it's not just between the US and China. Basically, because of the way supply chains are structured, if the US and China are having kind of a tit for tat in tariffs, then everybody else gets affected too, because China is so pivotal in global sourcing. And so what we see is that the rise in protectionism, and I mean, this is a multi-year phenomenon in that every country pledges not to be protectionist, and then they go and they are. So we're having to deal with a lot more complexity, and we're having to build very diverse supply chains. We're having to do double and triple sourcing, where you actually have plan B and C for sourcing different products. You have to relocate production very, very, very rapidly if the tariff situation changes. And then you also have something called tariff-based design, which is designing a product basically to meet different production and country of origin rules in order to access a given market at a lower tariff rate. So that's adding another element of complexity. And this is especially disadvantageous to small and medium-sized enterprises, because basically big multinationals, they have big government departments to go track all of this, all of these trade rules and tariff rules. The real people who are hurt are actually the SMEs, because they don't have big government departments, and they're often less well equipped to kind of navigate all this basically logistical and bureaucratic complexity in sourcing. And so that's where intermediaries become very important in basically making sure that SMEs, which actually generate the bulk of jobs in emerging markets, that they actually continue to have access to global trade in order to grow their own economies and to alleviate poverty and drive development. So basically, we're going to see a lot of changes in how goods are, in how production is managed, and that means that basically, and also because of just the trend towards digital, it means that we're going to have to be, the digital is basically going to help us become a lot more flexible in how we move production around. And basically, there's going to be some goods which countries are going to try to nearshore or onshore. And because of cost, because basically workers in developed countries cost a lot more, a lot of that's going to have to be automated or modular or somehow digital. So it's going to, I guess people are saying that there's going to be a lot more automated production moving around and coming back to developed countries. It doesn't mean that your white t-shirt isn't going to come from a developing country. It's just that there will be certain products which actually are produced nearer to home. So in terms of what we're seeing next for the future, I actually think that without knowing basically a whole lot about what the UN procures and so on, I think there's going to be 4 themes you could say that you're grappling with, and I'm hoping to probe a bit on how you are all reflecting on these. So the first is digital. It's like, because technology enables us to do so much more. Basically, the question becomes, how are you driving efficiency using digitization in terms of the design, sampling, approval, shipments, recycling, and disposal now? Are you accounting for all of the goods that you source, and what is the process that you're using? Does that take full advantage of digital capabilities now? And it's not just a single transaction that you're dealing with. Basically, if you digitize everything, you have a lot of data, which you can use then to drive more efficiency in your supply chain. And then eventually, one of the benefits of data-driven data-driven supply chains is that you actually make decisions more objectively based on facts, based on scientific analysis. And in some countries, obviously, digitization is a huge threat because it's a threat to corruption, which is actually a good thing. And then also in terms of how you're relating to vendors, in terms of your qualification and your assessment processes, your monitoring, and reporting online. Basically, once you start to digitize the entire assessment process, you can then basically feed back to the vendor how they're doing. What is there, just like carbon footprint per square meter. We would like to tell vendors which are making similar products, look, your environmental data, your production data, your at which percentile in your peer group, and that basically motivates them, because vendors all want to know, how am I doing compared to other vendors, especially now that it's not just about price. It's about how efficient you are, how fast you are, how environmentally efficient you are. It's not just about what the price of the product is. So in terms of the whole process of driving improvement, what are the different ways that you're using digital? The second one is in terms of ethics. Now, it used to be, like I said, it used to be that you could just qualify your suppliers and then they pledge not to do anything wrong. And you make a once-a-year visit to them and make sure that on that day that they're not doing anything wrong. But nowadays, actually, it's just because you're not dealing with ordinary consumers who are buying goods at CVS, okay, doesn't mean that your supply chain cannot be leveraged to create a greater good. Okay, so can you use the weight of the UN to do impact sourcing using your scale to affect change? Can you support or at least consider minority, female-owned, entrepreneurial businesses and businesses which actually invest in their workers, giving their workers skills that the workers will need when they leave the factory? Because these days, workers aren't going to stay in the factory for like 30 years, okay? The workers there for a certain period of time, and they're looking to get out and keep advancing their career, just like any white-collar worker is. So what is the factory doing to actually empower the workers and participate in that worker's education, so that worker actually becomes like a better citizen and more able to drive their own career and to contribute to society? So that's also a shift in, how producers and supply chains are actually viewing the workers. It's not utilitarian anymore. It's actually empowering. And then the last one, and in terms of ethical, is that we always thought that long-term relationships with vendors is something that is good. And to a certain extent, that's yes. But you want to make sure that actually those long-term vendors keep upgrading themselves, keep learning new skills, keep upgrading their competitiveness. And so there's a balance between, you being the sole buyer in a producer versus ensuring that producer actually has to go out and look for new business and understand what's on the market, and with your support to bring in other buyers to their factory. So it's like, to what degree are you contributing to the indigenous indigenous industrial development in the place from which you source? In terms of sustainability, this is really kind of obvious in that, you should be, are you tracking the carbon, water, waste, recycling, different pollutants, wastewater in your supply chain? And are you helping your supply chain basically achieve the SDGs? In terms of helping the suppliers achieve the SDGs for their different country? Are you aligning with the science-based targets within your supply chain? you know, UN has huge supply chains, so and it should be a model for how supply chain should work globally. And then in terms of, you know, all these kind of efficiencies and dealing with environmental impact, is that there's a lot of learning loops that need to be established because nobody's got all the answers to how to be efficient, how to be sustainable, because the bar is always moving. You know, SDGs is a huge target. We're not going to get there just by deciding what the best practices and everyone doing them. So that all the best practices always have to be improving. And we have tools to help them do that, but it's like many people have to participate and contribute. And the last one is on transparency. So it goes back to the fact that consumers can find out everything. So we better tell our story so that our story doesn't get told for us. But that's also true. That's also true for the UN, and it's also true internally within the supply chain. And so, you know, are you open book with your suppliers? Are you helping your suppliers understand where they stand competitively? Are you transparent in that process of where you're considering several suppliers? It's like we as a world, we're moving to this era of hyper transparency, and you can see it even today. You know, that if you're a public official, you might be videoed, you know, whenever you do anything, and you can see that with policing today. It's the hyper transparent world. So what are you doing in order to help your supply chain adapt to that, facing the public and also internally? Because it's a mindset shift. It's like you need to be basically okay with your information being out there, so long as you know, it's a solid case. So that's basically all I have. Should we go to the Q&A, or I mean, I'd love to hear what you all think of this.